again. So hopefully no one notices. Gospels, can we trust their authorship? Now, Dawkins on the Gospel. The Gospels are not reliable accounts of what happened in the history of the real world. All were written long after the death of Jesus and also after the epistles of Paul, which mention almost none of the alleged facts of Jesus' life. So that's from The God Delusion, 2006. He again says, nobody knows who the four evangelists were, but they almost certainly never met Jesus personally. These are arguments that you often hear the Dawa teams try to pose. So this is the overview of the evidence that the New Testament is true, and in particular, I'm going to be focusing on the Gospels. When and by whom were the Gospels written? Are the Gospels based on credible eyewitness testimony? The criterion of embarrassment, which I think works in the case of the Bible, but not so much in other situations, as we'll see. The principle of restraint and the testimony of martyrs. So we start with when and by whom were the Gospels written. Now, in terms of the dating of the New Testament, you'll see different dates mentioned, but I think these are good approximations of the dating of the different parts of the New Testament. So we have roughly shortly after 30 AD, we have the crucifixion, and then 70 AD, we have the destruction of the temple. Okay. And so that's basically just under a 40-year period. Okay. So if we imagine the witnesses being in their 20s or 30s, it's conceivable that many of the witnesses would have been still alive at the time of the destruction of the temple. So we have Paul about there, James there, and the Acts about there. We have 1 Corinthians stated about there. The Creed, or at least the earliest version of the Creed, which refers to the death and resurrection of Jesus in that first decade after the crucifixion. And we have Luke just after the 61, 62 AD. And then before Luke, we have Mark. We also have Romans, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians about there. And then pretty much most, if not all, of the New Testament by about 70 AD. John's Gospel and the book of Revelation, also connected with John, would be very late. So we're talking about 70 or 80 AD or further along, which is actually fine because we're talking about someone who was there in the midst of it, and the fact that it's later doesn't affect its reliability at all. In fact, it helps narrow the gap between the Gospels and the Church Fathers. So it's quite useful that he wrote his quite late. And those are that is the age of the eyewitnesses, or the period in which the eyewitnesses gave their testimony. Okay, so who wrote the Gospels? You'll recognize this figure of Bart Ehrman. He says some books, such as the Gospels, had been written anonymously, only later to be ascribed to certain authors who probably did not write them, apostles and friends of the apostles. So he wrote that in Jesus Interrupted, 2011. Now we have, against that, we have early attestations of authorship. So as you can see, the different years, Tertullian of Carthage, 207 AD, roughly. Clement of Alexandria, 180. Irenaeus of Lyon, 180. Muratorian fragment, 170. Justin Martyr, 150. And Papias of Hierapolis, 125 AD. So considering the relatively late date of John's Gospel, we're not talking about a long period after that. Now, we see here on the map that there is quite a broad geographical spread of attestation. So we're not talking about a few people in just one narrow area saying that these gospels were written by certain people. The fact that we have these from all over the Christian world would suggest that actually this is a universal idea, that these in fact are the real authors. So we'll start with the authorship of Mark, and we have here Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr tells us that the apostles themselves composed memoirs which are called Gospels, and this is from the First Apology, chapter 66. In chapter 106 of his dialogue with Trypho, dated around 160 AD, he writes, "And when it is said that he changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, and when it is written in the memoirs of him that this so happened, as well as that he changed the names of other brothers, the sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, which means sons of thunder." We have Tertullian of Carthage. And Tertullian says that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. And we also have Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus of Lyon, in his book Against Heresies, and I just point out who himself was a disciple of Polycarp, a companion of the apostles, tells us that Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. We also have Clement of Alexandria, and this is quoted by Eusebius in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 2, chapter 15, who tells us that those who heard Peter's teaching were not satisfied with merely a single hearing or with the unwritten teaching of the divine gospel, but with all sorts of entreaties they besought Mark, who was a follower of Peter and whose gospel is extant, to leave behind with them in writing a record of the teaching passed on to them orally. As you can see, the teaching was given orally first and then it was written down. And then, of course, we have Papias of Hierapolis, who, according to Eusebius, Book 5, chapter 8, tells us, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. So you can see there, not only do we have who Mark is, but the fact that he's an interpreter of Peter, and so therefore a reliable source. Of course, Peter being one of the primary witnesses, so a good source to base a gospel on. Now, it's worth noting that Mark is an unlikely choice. Mark is an unlikely choice for a false attribution of authorship. The apocryphal forgeries routinely attribute their gospels to high-profile figures such as Peter, James, and Thomas. John Mark is best known for having caused a sharp fallout between Paul and Barnabas over having withdrawn from them in Pamphylia. Since the early church believed Mark's gospel to convey the teachings of Peter, it seems likely that it would have been attributed to Peter had the early church not felt constrained by the fact that Mark really did write the gospel that bears his name. So just by the mere fact that they did call it Mark and not just simply Peter's gospel is very telling there. And then there's internal evidence. The frequent mention of Peter in Mark's gospel. Mark refers to Peter a total of 26 times, whereas Matthew mentions Peter only 3 additional times, despite the fact that Matthew's gospel is about double the length of Mark's gospel. Mark is the only gospel author who does not use Simon Peter when talking about Peter, instead using either Simon or Peter. Simon was a very common name in Palestine, but Mark does not distinguish him from other Simons. This suggests familiarity. Mark's gospel is bookended with the disciple Peter. He is the first and last disciple mentioned. This is a phenomenon that has been identified in other ancient texts where source is attributed to a particular eyewitness. So the fact that you have Peter mentioned at the beginning and end is a good indication of the source of his material there. Now we move on to the authorship of John. And now we look at the internal evidence for John. John's gospel claims to be written by, quote, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And again, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. John 21:24. The three Johannine epistles and John's gospel are clearly written by the same author. Tertullian of Carthage, in his book Against Marcion, book 4, chapter 2, tells us that of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instilled faith in us, whilst of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renewed afterwards. Now, it's unclear there whether he's talking chronologically or in order of importance, but he seems to put John and Matthew in first place in terms of the importance of their Gospels, with Luke and Mark following. It doesn't appear to be accurate in terms of it being the chronological case. So I would reckon that what he means is in terms of their value as Gospels, maybe due to their length and their depth of theology and so on. Then we have Clement of Alexandria, in his still extant writings, makes several mentions of the Gospel according to John and quotes out of it. Eusebius also quotes Clement in his Ecclesiastical History, book 3, chapter 24. And when Mark and Luke had already published their Gospels, they say that John, who had employed all his time in proclaiming the Gospel orally, finally proceeded to write. Now, this may explain the reason why a lot of the Gospels were delayed, by a number of years. Their immediate impulse wasn't to sit down writing Gospels, but to get out there and tell the world about the story of Jesus and what had happened, rather than, as I say, becoming book writers. The value of writing the stories down wasn't immediately evident to them. They thought the world was going to end at any stage, that Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. So therefore they didn't immediately go writing. But as they started getting older and as witnesses started dying off, they realized that they needed to hurry up and write their Gospels down. And then we have Irenaeus of Lyon, and he wrote Against Heresies, book 3. Chapter 3 is what we're going to be looking at here. He tells us that John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. Okay. Irenaeus also frequently quotes from John's gospel by name. So I think that's a very strong attestation, especially considering Irenaeus' very close connection with John via Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of John, and Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp. So that's not much of a gap there, even though there might be a few decades between them. I think the human personal connection there is sufficient as evidence for that attestation having authority. And I mentioned Polycarp. Polycarp of Smyrna He was a student of the Apostle John, as I've just said. In his epistle to the Philippines, he alludes to 1 John 4:2-3, and says, to deny that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is to be Antichrist. Consonant with what we find from the internal evidence, church tradition identifies the author of the fourth gospel with the Apostle John. And this is from Craig Kinner, The Gospel of John, and you can see all the rest there. And here we have D.A. Carson, The Gospel According to John, and you can see all the other info there at the bottom, page 68. And he says, we have already traced the principal external evidence, i.e. evidence outside the fourth gospel itself, that maintains the evangelist was none other than the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee. That evidence, such as it is virtually unanimous. Even if Irenaeus, towards the end of the 2nd century, is amongst the strongest, totally unambiguous witnesses, his personal connection with Polycarp, who knew John, means the distance in terms of personal memories is not very great. Even Dodd, who discounts the view that the Apostle John wrote the fourth gospel, considers the external evidence formidable, adding, of any external evidence to the contrary that could be called cogent, I am not aware. So that's a really strong point there. We move now on to the authorship of Luke. Here's the external evidence. The authorship of Luke is attested by Tertullian of Carthage, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus of Lyon. And in terms of the internal evidence, Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are clearly written by the same author. The author of Acts was clearly a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. The Pauline epistles indicate that Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. You can see the references there. And perhaps for the first one, Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are clearly written by the same author. We can see that by the fact of how both of those are begun. There's a reference to each other and the fact that they are the same author. We also have medical terminology. Colossians 4:14 tells us that Luke was a physician. The book of Acts uses terminology found in ancient medical literature, which reinforces that piece of evidence. So this is from Acts 28:8-9. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed, and laid his hands on him, and healed him. So when this was done, others also, which had diseases in the island, came and were healed. Now, what's interesting is the Greek expression puretos K, or puritos K, ducenterio sunekomenon, and apologies for my terrible pronunciation, suffering from a fever and dysentery, are terms used in ancient medical literature. The other gospel writers use puritos in the singular for a fever, but Luke always used it in the plural, puretoi, which was the correct medical usage as found in the Hippocratic writings. So this reinforces the idea that yes, he indeed was a doctor, as indicated in Colossians, and he knew his terminology and used it correctly. In describing the man suffering from dropsy, Luke 14:2, Luke employs the medical terminology hydropikos, a word occurring nowhere else in the Bible, but which appears frequently in the medical literature, especially in the writings of Hippocrates. The word hydropikos is derived from hudor, water, and means literally a surplus of fluid in the body tissues. Now, we can also look for evidence in terms of the early use of the Gospels and Acts. Now, if we compare that with spurious Gospels, we can see that there's a clear difference. The Gospels, which are frequently referred to by the church fathers, the early church fathers like Ignatius and Irenaeus and so on, we can see that they're all using those Gospels and the Acts, whereas the other ones, they're hardly referred to at all. And probably when they do, it's probably more a case of saying that they're heretical. But as you can see, they're not used. So, it isn't a mystery why the particular Gospels were canonized, whereas the others weren't. Now, in terms of that then, we have, are the Gospels based on credible eyewitness testimony? So, I suppose one way of looking at that would be the test of personal names. We have Jewish personal names here. This is a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham. It's based on a study of 3,000 names. Palestinian Jewish names are different from names from elsewhere. Gospels and Acts accurately reflect naming patterns of Palestine. So that's a good way of showing that these are accurate accounts. So if we look at Jewish male names in Palestine, or Israel if you prefer, okay, so rank outside the New Testament, 1, 2, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have Simon or Simeon, Joseph, Joses, Lazarus, Judas, Judah, John, Johanan, and Jesus, Joshua. And you can see there in terms of the number of New Testament individuals for Simon or Simeon, we have 8. Josephus, we got 6. And Lazarus, we got 1, and so on. Okay, so it fits in nicely. They are the right sort of names we would expect to find. In terms of Jewish male names in Egypt, again, we see that there are a high frequency of the right sort of names. Okay, so we can see the ranking there in Egypt and their ranking in Palestine. Okay. Now, in terms of the disciples, then Matthew 10, 2-4, we have the names of the 12 apostles. These are first Simon, 1, called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon, and Judas Iscariot. Okay, so you can see that each of them are matching up in terms of names that you would expect. Okay, so we move on now to the test of detail. Okay, so in terms of Acts, there are 84 historically confirmed eyewitness details. Luke includes several others in his gospel. John has 59 historically confirmed or historically probable eyewitness details. And the New Testament documents cite more than 30 people confirmed by secular sources or archaeology. Now, this here is very strong evidence to show that this is not simply just a novel written by someone centuries later. It suggests that this is a historical document written at the time. There's too much that they have got right. So it must mean that this is a reliable document and it is from the time. Scholars say that Acts is authoritative. This is from the archaeologist William Ramsay, St. Paul the Traveller and Roman Citizen, page 8. I began with a mind unfavourable to it, the Acts, but more recently I found myself brought into contact with the Book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne in upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. Now, number 3, the test of political awareness. And these are the historical figures in the New Testament. As you can see from the list and from the spread throughout the different books of the New Testament, you can see a great deal of knowledge of the various historical figures. And even more here. So that's good evidence to support the idea that this was a document from the time that was historically accurate, that knows what it's talking about. It's got the right names in the right places and so on. Now, we also have undesigned coincidences. So you have John's Gospel, say, and Mark's Gospel, and Luke's Gospel, and Matthew's Gospel, each written separate from each other. Obviously, they've made borrowings, but sometimes there are coincidences that you cannot explain, which strengthens the case that they are truthful documents. And these are sort of accidental details that corroborate each other. Sometimes two works by different authors interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were copied from the other or both were copied from a common source. For example, one book may mention in passing a detail that answers some question raised by the other. The two records fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. An example, inventing a gospel story. The setup for the miracle story is going to have to do with money and food. Which disciple do you pick? So we have here, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Question is, why Philip? Why is Philip mentioned here? Luke 9:10-11. On their return, the apostles told him all that they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds learned it, they followed him. So we have a reference here to a town. And if we put the pieces together, it's very interesting. John 12:21 says, "So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee." So Luke and John interlock. Luke doesn't mention Philip in this context at all. John doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle. Only by putting them together can we understand why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6:5. Okay, so what is happening here is that each of these Gospels are giving some of the details, but there's an overlap between the two, allowing us to fit them together just like a jigsaw. This would only occur if these are telling accurate, truthful accounts. So the significance here, one undesigned coincidence might be an accident, like having two unrelated pieces of a jigsaw puzzle fit together just by chance. But if we discover numerous undesigned coincidences crisscrossing the documents, it becomes ridiculous to insist that they are all just accidental. Another example, this is from Mark 6:31 and 39. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. And what about that green grass? Well, in John 6:4, it's mentioned that the Jewish Passover festival was near. So that's when you have green grass. We're talking about April. That's when the Passover happens. So hence green grass fits. Now, what about this one? I will destroy this temple. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Mark 14:58, 15:29. Nothing in the Synoptic Gospels provides a pretext for this accusation. So simply, it reports the accusation. It doesn't tell us what happened to bring about this accusation. But look at John 2:18-19. So the Jews said to him, What sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So John gives us the original statement of Jesus, but not its use as an accusation. The Synoptics give us the accusation, but not the original statement. Neither of these is copied from the other. So I think that's pretty solid evidence of the reliability there of the Gospels. Now, move on now to the criterion of embarrassment. Now, I suppose before I go into the criterion of embarrassment, the criterion of embarrassment doesn't necessarily work in every context. Like, for example, if we talk about the Islamic literature and we talk about the hadiths and so on, some people would argue, well, because the material in that are embarrassing, then therefore it must be true. But when you're talking about things like that, things which are vulgar and sexually immoral and so on, they may not necessarily be embarrassing for that culture where it's long been established that they accept those things. You only need to look at the life within the household of the caliphs. But within a Christian context, those same things which are embarrassing would not be included because they would contradict the message of the gospel and so on. So I would say we're not dealing with like here in terms of that criteria. But in any case, let's look at the disciples. So they're presented often as dim-witted. They fail to understand what Jesus is saying, as you can see in those 3 examples. If you are making a gospel up, and obviously you don't have anything like this before, so this is not like we have a second shot at creating this style of writing, you would not be presenting them as dim-witted. You would probably be talking them up and say what clever people they were and so on. They are uncaring. For example, they fall asleep on Jesus twice. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. They are rebuked. Peter is called Satan by Jesus. Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong about a theological issue, Galatians 2:11. They are cowards. Peter denies Christ 3 times. The disciples run away. The women are the brave ones. They are doubters. Despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. Some are even doubtful after they see him risen. So if you are trying to make something up, this is not the way you go about it. This is not very positive towards the early leaders of the church. Surely they would have painted them in a much better light. They would have covered over this material. And what about Jesus himself? Is considered out of his mind by his own family who come to seize him to take him home. Is deserted by many of his followers. Surely they would have brushed these details out if they were being dishonest. Is not believed by his own brothers, John 7:5. Is thought to be a deceiver. Turns off Jewish believers to the point that they want to stone him. is called a madman. It's called a drunkard. It's called demon-possessed. Has his feet wiped with hair of a prostitute. Is ignorant of the date of his return. Is crucified despite the fact that anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. So these are not the sort of details that you would want to put in a book in which you want people to believe in. These are not helpful. It would be far better to whitewash the story to make it more believable. Now, the principle of restraint. Not once did Jesus address many of the major topics of controversy and debate in the early church, including whether believers had to be circumcised, how to regulate speaking in tongues, what roles were open to women in ministry. So the fact that they're holding back, they're not giving it all away, it speaks highly towards it. And what about the testimony of martyrs? So we have Cornelius Tacitus here. I've forgotten what the significance of Tacitus here, but anyway, the significance of martyrdom. What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? Why would they die for a known lie? Okay, it's one thing to make up a lie, but would you die for it? Would you be like Peter, not only to die for it, but be willing to be crucified upside down for it? Doesn't seem very likely. The martyrdoms of Peter and James, the Lord's brother, are particularly well attested. Surely, if they were making this stuff up, they would have attempted to avoid being killed. They would have said, hey, do you know what? This is not true. We'll go quietly and avoid getting ourselves killed. No, they protested that they were telling the truth to the very end. So there we have it. We had a look at when and by whom were the Gospels written. Are the Gospels based on credible eyewitness testimony? We looked at the criterion of embarrassment, the principle of restraint, and the testimony of martyrs. I think when you look at all of the evidence together, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that these are essentially truthful documents. Now, if you want to read further on this topic, you can have a look at these books here, which are on your screen. I'm sure some of these you will already know of. And that's it from me today. Come back to you now. Now, hello to all of you in the house. I had a bad start there. I should say that I had too much private information showing in the first attempt to do the video, so I had to stop it and get rid of it and then come back. So Carl says, Mel, it's the Gremlins. It sure is. Like Orthodox Empire, Dawkins Law. The oldest biography of Alexander the Great was written in the 1st century by the Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus. That was 300 years after Alexander's death. That's a good point. Repent. Thank you, Mel. We'll watch later. Take care. Okay. Using medical terminology from the time. Very clever. Last point here. Oh, that was a lot of work. Thanks for the info. Well, this was something I was given. I was given the document. I thought it's worth sharing. I'm sure a lot of this material you will have seen before, but it's good to have it all together, ready to hand if you need that sort of information. So I'll leave it at that for today. Thanks all for tuning in. I hope it was some help to you. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.